Welcome to MQC, the Massachusetts Quadball Chat for off-pitch chats with Carsen and Sierra. Going to be starting things off this week with a recap of this past weekend.
And we were wrong. RPI went 2-0 on the weekend and made us look a little silly.
Yeah, RPI came from behind both games this weekend against Emerson and BU, showing that they can pull things together to close out some games in range.
Yeah, I think overall RPI relied pretty heavily on Anson Decker as a driving threat, and also Ad Ojo in the Seeking game to get them back into their games. The fly catch that Ad had against BU put RPI ahead, and then the catch in the Emerson game put them in a next goal win scenario that went awry for Emerson after being up 4 goals prior to the catch.
Yeah, I think going forward to your point, I think Anson was only able to get a lot of those drives because RPI relied so heavily on their beaters just running 1.5. And I think going forward, they'll want to kind of figure out some ways to get back to a little bit more of like the passing heavy offense, incorporating some shots into that and getting their beaters to be a little bit more creative than just throwing one back.
BU still did go 1-1 on the weekend, and it felt like their success was much more spread out this weekend rather than relying heavily on like Ethan Dillon to succeed. I think more people succeeded, and that really showed. And this also felt like the first weekend that Cleo Brooks was challenged in the beater game, and it was great to see her problem solve through those plays.
Yeah, and Emerson, I think they had a phenomenal weekend, even going 0-2. They lost both games, but I think both games were actually really impressive showings for them. Specifically, Janie Hillman and Adrian Manansala in the beating game, and Amiri Rivera in the chasing game. As a D2 team that's kind of historically struggled to play those D1 talented teams, I think they've proven that they can kind of hang with them. And so, I think with, some conditioning and a couple more strategic adjustments, I think they're on an upward trajectory to really challenge some of these more like 3rd through 5th of the D1 rankings teams going forward.
Yeah, and then for our Harvard UVM Middlebury series, there's a little less to talk about here.
Yeah, to no one's surprise, Harvard went 2-0. Things looked a little bit messy for them to kick off the Middlebury game. Felt a lot closer than I think the score reflected, with Middlebury putting up some really solid defensive stops to kind of prolong the game. But in the end, Harvard took it. They easily course corrected for their second game of the day against UVM, looked a lot more cohesive. I think they were playing a lot more of their depth players, Jess Lee, Leo Freed, not getting as many minutes as they probably would in games come nationals. But actually, one thing about Harvard that I feel it's been like the first time it seemed like they actually had like almost a full roster. So that's pretty good to see. As a team that wants to make it far at nationals, they're going to need all that depth that they can get to make it through a 2-day tournament. So it was good to see that.
And then Middlebury won the battle for Vermont, 125-60. And while the game was close for portions of it, Jason Wu and Kate Petty were able to facilitate a really good run, and a great catch from Danny Smith closed out the game.
Yeah, sad for me, I was the flag runner. So moving on to this weekend, on Saturday, March 2nd at 10 a.m., going to be back at Harvard's Cumnock Fields for the next set of games.
Yeah, up first we have a round robin between UVM, Emerson, and Tufts.
I think a big question for this group is going to be how Tufts performs against the top teams in D2. They're sitting at like the bottom of the standings right now, so it's really how can they kind of figure out what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, Tufts beat Emerson at Boston Qualifier in November, but the last time they played UVM was September, and that was not a close game at all. UVM pretty commandingly won that game. So I think this weekend is what version of Tufts shows up.
Yeah, I know they have Beck Bergman and Cam Morrow, and I think if they have big games, that could force Tufts into a win against UVM or Emerson. Both are handy kind of playmakers, and Beck, is a reliable seeker. So I think they could try and rely on that a bit. But I think in order for that to work, it's going to take big games pre-flag runner on pitch to, kind of even put them in that conversation.
Yeah, and then I think the game to watch this weekend is going to be between UVM and Emerson.
Yeah, so far, those two teams, I think, are 2-1, favoring UVM. Emerson collecting the most recent victory, I believe, also at qualifiers. So that was a time. But yeah, it's really going to be kind of how they've adjusted to, what they've seen so far.
Yeah, UVM and Emerson, I think, will find an interesting matchup between Jack Fortin and Carter Boudreau on UVM, and then Amiri Rivera and Daniel Baradat on Emerson. Both pairs are really quick in the fast break and then dynamic in the half court. So I think it's a matter of who of these two pairs is going to come out on top.
Yeah. I think one thing that really could kind of put Emerson just with like a leg up is getting Ryan Leary a little more involved this weekend in their offense. I know she scored, I think, either the first or the second goal for Emerson in the RPI game this past weekend, but I feel like she's been relatively quiet despite like the insane levels of talent she has at like ripping shots and like the confidence in taking drives. So I'd really like to see Emerson get her more involved, maybe start the offense with the ball in her hand or something, because she is such a talent. And I think getting her more like integrated into the play is actually going to see a lot of success for them.
I agree. And I think Emerson against UVM pretty handily wins the beater matchup, but I think a battle between Janie Hillman of Emerson and Mary Babb of UVM will be exciting to see. Mary brings a lot of energy to her team the minute she subs in the game, and she has really smart decision making and effective skills, so she'll be a player to watch this weekend.
So up next is another round robin between Harvard, Brandeis, and Brown. So Harvard's currently sitting at number 2 in MQC's Division 1 standings. Brandeis is sitting at number 1, and Brown is at number 5. This weekend's going to be a pretty big deal because it's going to really determine who takes that number 1 spot in the Division 1 rankings between Brandeis and Harvard. So it should be a pretty good game to watch.
Yeah, we're going to start out with Brandeis versus Harvard. Harvard definitely has a beater advantage. David Chen and Jess Lee are probably the most talented beater pair in the college game right now, if not the top 3 most talented beater pairs in the college game. So there's nobody else really in this region that can stack up to them right now.
Yeah, they looked pretty unstoppable last weekend, pressing at half field almost the entire day until their coaches told them to stop. So I think to your point, they'll probably take the beating game, which brings us to the chasing game. I think Brandeis will likely look to rely a lot on like Eli Fighter and Shakti Kodaswaran. They're really dynamic players, can bring a lot of just like kind of confidence on the offensive side to put up some points on Harvard. I think it's going to prove pretty difficult because Harvard has so many different players that they can throw at Brandeis. They have Anna Blanchfield, Leo Freed, Anna Louisa Nikolai, Aiden Higgins, just like such a variety of play styles, whether it's driving, cutting, shooting, like all the different things that you would want to see in a college team, Harvard has it. So I think it's going to be pretty hard for Brandeis to actually compete when the game gets going.
Yeah, and I think Brandeis would also usually find themselves at an advantage in the Seeker game. Eli Seeks, Shakti Seeks, and then Rowan Scasalati as well are all very successful. And they're going against Team USA's own Leo Freed, who is pretty much automatic against the flag runners in the MQC. So I think this weekend it may be just who gets there first.
Yeah, I think another thing that's also worth mentioning is this is going to be Brandeis' first time playing in the spring semester. So while they're going to want to come out strong, prove that they are a team that can contend, there's likely going to be a little bit of rust, a little bit of stuff that, it looks great in practice, but when you get against a different team, it just looks a little different. And while Brandeis is a really good team, I do unfortunately think for them, they're just going to be a little bit outclassed by Harvard. Harvard has so much depth. They have some of the most talented people in college right now at each individual position. So I think it's going to be a pretty tough game. Hopefully it'll be close and really good to watch, but I think Harvard in the end likely to take it. But my potential hot take is I think the Brandeis Brown game is going to be closer than the Brandeis Harvard game is actually going to end up being.
Okay. And then the story this weekend for Brown and Harvard is Andrew Steinberg facing off against his former team for the first time since joining the Harvard squad. He was almost single-handedly responsible for Brown's outstanding success in the 21-22 season. So it'll be interesting to see how he stacks up against some former teammates, specifically Will Richardson.
Yeah, I remember Steinberg that year, I think is actually a huge reason that Brown actually got moved up to D1 from D2. On the Brown side, I think, we've talked about them before, but Will Richardson and Muhim Ali, I think are going to have pretty outstanding weekends in order to put up some points on Harvard. But I think they're going to find a lot more success against Brandeis. While I think Brandeis offensively is super dynamic and they have some really good physical players on defense, I think Will Richardson and Muhim are just so confident at taking space. They know kind of what they want to do. I do think Brandeis will probably have a bit of an edge there just because they'll have a little bit more depth than Brown. But I don't think that Brown is a team that Brandis can really take lightly at all if they want to end up, getting a win on the weekend.
And then to get into our predictions for the weekend, for our first round robin, I think Harvard's pretty securely going to go 2-0, with Brandeis following up with a quick 1-1 and Brown going 0-2.
I don't think there's any controversy on those ones. I think that's probably how the weekend's going to end up going. I'd agree with all that. I think for the other one with Emerson, UVM, and Tufts, I think with how Emerson played this past weekend, if they can kind of replicate that success, I think they should go 2-0 pretty handedly. I think UVM will likely go 1-1, and Tufts, again, based off of how they've played in the spring semester so far, I think is probably looking at 0-2.
Yeah, I think on paper, Emerson should take the weekend. However, I think UVM could really easily play a spoiler. I think Emerson, while having success this past weekend and historically, not been able to close out games even when they're ahead. And depending on the squad they bring, the energy they bring, I think UVM has a pretty good argument to go 2-0 as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, you guys can tune in next week to see how everything went for a recap. Thanks for joining us this week, and make sure to tune into the MQC Facebook page for a live stream of this weekend's games starting at 10 a.m.